Now it's time to welcome our first speaker, Erin Peck. She is a geologist who works in salt marshes. So she measures how marshes grow and bury carbon in an effort to stay above rising water in order to protect those coastal communities. And so as an exciting bonus in her samples, she sometimes finds 300-year-old tsunami sand from the last major Oregon earthquake. And so listen up and find out how she goes about that. So Erin, you may now share your screen, start your video, and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks, Lindsay, for organizing this. I'm Erin. I am a graduate student and geologist at Oregon State University, and I'm going to chat with you all today about my love of geology, mud, and salt marshes. But first, I wanted to tell you all a little bit about my background and how I got so excited about geology and dirt. So when I was growing up, I did not know what I wanted to be. And in retrospect, it definitely appeared that I had a direct or sort of an obvious route into science. And that's because most everyone in my family are scientists or engineers. And actually, in some ways, I'm the black sheep of the family because my parents are both aerospace engineers and they designed helicopters. And my youngest sister is a professional pilot. But it was great when I was young to see my mom as an engineer, which is still a very male dominated career. So that gave me a sense that science was a field that was open to me, just as it's open to all of you. So I graduated from high school and I went to college. I grew up in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia, and I went to a small college out there, and I planned to become a doctor because it seemed like an obvious career path. But my first ever day of class in college, it was an advanced calculus class. And I don't know exactly how I placed into it. And I was completely in over my head. And I knew I had to drop the class. And in college, you can actually do that. Some subjects you don't have to take if you decide you don't want to. But the only class that was available to fill my schedule was this introductory geology class. And I'd never taken an earth science class before ever. I went to a great public school, but they really didn't focus on the environmental sciences. It was mostly biology, chemistry, and physics. So I took this geology class and I was hooked. I really loved it. I loved reading about the earth. I loved looking at rocks. I loved playing with sediment flumes. They're basically these really large scientific sandboxes. And so it was my thing and it really clicked. And I remember talking with my parents about deciding to declare an environmental science and geology major. And my dad actually told me that my first ever word was dirt. So apparently, baby me had picked dirt, but I'd forgotten my fascination with it. And then I rediscovered my love for it. And so now I'm a researcher of dirt. Sometimes I call it mud, and sometimes I call it sediment. But I just wanted to share this story because I wanted to share a perspective of not knowing what you're most interested in or what you want to do, but then finding it. And I found my thing relatively early. Many people don't find their thing that they're in love with until they're even older than I am now. So it's great that you're all attending these webinars and exposing yourselves to lots of new things. Always keep doing that and always keep learning. So now I really enjoy mud and rocks, both for my work and also for fun. Here's me covered in mud from mountain biking and me climbing andesite, which is a common rock here in Oregon, and also me climbing at Smith Rock in Eastern Oregon on volcanic tuff, which is also called ignimbrite. So a little bit more about my career path. I went to Franklin and Marshall College, which is a very small liberal arts college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I received a bachelor's of arts in environmental science and geology, and I took a lot of fun and really rigorous courses that taught me how to write and how to think critically and how to explore science creatively. My program was really small, but it had lots of opportunities to do research and to go on field trips. We studied geology all across the Northeast, and I was also able to go on a field trip to Hawaii to study volcanoes. And Franklin and Marshall College is actually a part of a select group of colleges and universities that focus their financial aid resources exclusively on need-based financial aid. So I know it's a little early for many of you to think about colleges, but I really can't oversell Franklin and Marshall enough. So I applied for graduate school in my senior year of college because I knew I wanted to continue to do research. And I was really excited to get into Oregon State University. And since being here, I've completed my master's degree, a graduate certificate in college and university teaching, a minor in risk and uncertainty assessment and marine systems. And I've worked with Oregon Sea Grant on a ton of research projects and outreach activities. And I'm also going to defend my PhD in a few months. So that'll be exciting. But being a graduate student is definitely difficult. I can't sugarcoat that too much. It's a lot of hard work and we have a lot of responsibilities, but it can also be really fun. I'm constantly learning, and the majority of the time I get to choose what I want to learn. And there's a ton of variability in the things I do. I take classes, I do field work, I do lab work, I do a lot of data analysis and coding. I teach, and recently I've learned how to teach online. I do a lot of writing, I make maps and I make scientific illustrations. I go to conferences, I do outreach, and I communicate my science to the public. I end up doing a lot of troubleshooting and a lot of head scratching, and it's often a lot of fun, but sometimes it can be boring and it can definitely feel too difficult, but it's always rewarding. So now I'm going to share some background about my research. So I study salt marshes, and this is a picture of my favorite Oregon salt marsh, the Salmon River Estuary, from the 1960s. So salt marshes in Oregon line the edges of estuaries. Estuaries are also called bays, and they're bodies of water where the river meets the ocean. And salt marshes are these muddy areas with lots of grasses that are above water during low tides, but underwater during high tides or big storms. And these ecosystems are really important, but they've been threatened by climate change and also humans changing the landscape. And most all of the land, besides the hills in this photo, should actually be salt marsh. But there's only this one area that we call undisturbed or least disturbed salt marsh. Areas that have been converted for human use, we call reclaimed. And this bit of land here was actually a water park called Pixie Land. You can look up cool pictures of it on the internet, but it closed only after being open for a few years. You can probably guess why. And water park on the Oregon coast is not the best idea. But the state of Oregon is actually really special because it's been an early supporter of restoration of these reclaimed salt marshes back to their original ecosystems. And so in the Salmon River Estuary, most of this area has actually already been restored. So all of this area in here, over here, these were fields for grazing, and up here, all of this has been converted back to salt marsh. So it's great. And salt marshes are very important habitats because they provide what we call ecosystem services. And these are the services that are valuable to us from both a cultural standpoint and also a monetary one. So often ecosystems provide us with things that we can't engineer because it's either too difficult or much too costly. So these include things like flood protection of coastal communities during large storm events. Salt marshes also filter out pollutants from the water, making the water cleaner. Salt marshes are also important habitats for many different types of species, including fish like salmon and migratory birds. And salt marshes do something really important, which is they suck up a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a big cause of global climate change, as many of you know. And salt marshes actually slow climate change by burying a lot of this extra carbon in the atmosphere. But it turns out that salt marshes are also really important to scientists like myself because they record the recent history of the Earth. And they do this by growing and accumulating sediment over time. So they grow and they accumulate sediment. And much of this sediment or mud comes from the rivers, and the rivers bring this mud and sediment in from the mountains and the fields and places where we live. And so as climate changes and as the landscape changes, either naturally or because of things that we do, the type and the amount of sediment that accumulates in the salt marsh will change over time. And the youngest sediment is always at the surface, and the oldest sediment is always down deep. And so we can collect what we call sediment cores, They're basically these big tubes filled with mud, and we can see the layers in the mud. And in the lab, so we take these sediment cores back to the lab and we can look at the layers of mud, and it requires some interpretation, but this is how we can learn about the history back when there weren't any written records. So we can sort of read these sediment cores as if they were written records of the earth. And one thing we can learn about from these sediment cores is sea level rise. So as sea level rises because of climate change or other reasons, it makes the salt marshes grow faster because the plants don't want to drown. And actually, this is another ecosystem service that salt marshes provide us with. So as we change climate and we cause sea level to rise, the salt marshes will actually grow taller and they'll continue to protect coastal communities from flooding. And like I mentioned before, land use changes can affect the amount of sediment and cause the marsh to grow and trap more of this mud. And that mud will look like wherever it's coming from. So for instance, if there's a wildfire, then the type of mud that ends up accumulating in the marsh will look like it's from a burned forest. And also the Oregon coast experiences earthquakes. So every 500 years or so, Oregon experiences some of the largest earthquakes on Earth. And these earthquakes can cause huge waves that we call tsunami. And the tsunami pick up and carry beach sand into coastal areas, including salt marshes. And it turns out that we know that this happens because we can see these sandy layers deep in the salt marsh sediment cores. And this is actually partially why we know that the last large earthquake in Oregon happened 300 years ago in 1700. So now I'm just going to finish up by showing you all a video of how we collect sediment cores. So let me see if I can get this to work. And I will drop a link to this in the chat later. But okay, so this is actually video that we collected from the Salmon River estuary, that picture that I showed you earlier. And this is actually a field course. So we go out with other students with these big, long PVC pipes. We actually buy them from Home Depot, so you could do this yourself. And they are 3 meters long, which I cannot convert that to feet for you, but it's like 2 of me, maybe 1.5 of me. And then we stand on ladders and we use a sledgehammer and we hammer the core down deep. It takes a really long time. I don't know if you can, it takes about an hour or so to do this. So we hammer it in. And once the core is all the way down deep in the mud, we put what's called a test plug in the top. It's basically like putting your thumb over a straw filled with water and then pulling the straw up. You keep the water in, so it keeps the sediment in. And then we use, this is called a truck jack. These are these machines that you use to raise up cars or trucks so that you can change the tire. So we just slowly work the core back up. And then we carry them out. They're usually around 100 pounds, so it takes 2 to 3 people. It's incredibly awkward, as you can see, because we have to climb over channels and things. And so obviously this is way too long to drive around with and hanging out the back of your car. So we end up cutting them in half. And then once we've cut them in half, we bring them back to Oregon State University and do a bunch of work on them. And you can actually go and take a tour after COVID is over of the Oregon State Marine Geology Repository. And they have hundreds of these sediment cores from all over the world, including ours. And you can go and look at them. It's really fun. Okay. So that's it. Feel free to contact me if you have any burning questions, but I can also take questions now as well.
Fantastic, Erin. Thank you for your excellent presentation. It's always exciting to head out into the marsh via video, because I will say it brought back memories. I'm as a alumni of CEOS, of the College of Earth and Ocean Atmospheric Sciences. I went out there and helped remove cores from the marsh. So thanks for bringing me back. So if you are a student at OSU in the future, and they may still be doing it, that could be you in the marsh collecting cores from the marsh as part of a class. So great presentation. We have quite a few questions from our participants. So please feel free, participants, to ask questions as we're going through this question and answer at any time. But one question we have is, how does the marsh soak up the carbon dioxide? So if you want to go a little bit into that process.
That's a great question. I'm just going to go back to this one to have something to point at. It does it by two different ways. So one of the most obvious ways is that as plants grow, they pull CO2 or carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that's where a lot of the carbon that's causing climate change is stored, actually. So they soak up a bunch of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then over time the plants will die and they get buried down deep in the mud. And another way they soak up carbon is plants upriver in the mountains will do the same exact thing. They will die. They'll fall into the river. The river will carry that out as part of the sediment, and that will also eventually get buried in lots of different types of habitats, including salt marshes. And so one of the reasons why salt marshes are so good at burying carbon in relation to other habitats is because they accumulate so much mud. They grow really tall because as sea level rises, they need to grow tall in response.
Great, thank you, Erin, and great question, Hunter. We have a question from Aaliyah. How many times do you go out and take these sediment samples from this area? So if you're trying to quantify how marshes are burying carbon, how many times do you go out and sample that same area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have sediment cores from 8 different Oregon estuaries, all up and down the coast. And we've gone out multiple times to those 8 different estuaries. It just depends on, the data that we're receiving from the sediment cores that we collect. So sometimes the values that we measure for, say, carbon burial are really similar between all the sediment cores, and sometimes they're different. It just depends on sort of how diverse the habitat is. And so when we see lots of different values, we want to go out and collect more cores so that we know that we have a really comprehensive picture of the story. And so our record for collecting those long sediment cores is 10 in one day. So we go out frequently, but we can collect a lot when we go out. And I have a little bit over 100 of those sediment cores that I pulled data from. So it's a lot.
Fantastic. And so I'm going to combine some questions. So what is the coolest thing you've seen in your dirt samples? And then also, what is the oldest?
What is the oldest?
So I'm going to combine those two.
Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of cool things you see. One time we saw a shotgun shell in the core. That was really surprising. We have never seen any artifacts from the Native Americans that lived here. Another cool thing that we saw in a sediment core was we one time hammered the core all the way into the ground, and we pulled that blue thing off the top to look down inside of it, and there was this little snail was directly in the center. So he probably had a really terrible time having to hear us hit the core over and over again. So that was kind of interesting. But yeah, and then the oldest, so I said those are 3 meters long. So I think it's about 1.5 of me. So maybe it's around, I don't know, 10 feet or so. The oldest we estimate is around 800 years old. So that seems really old from us as human perspective. But in terms of the age of the earth, it's really, really young. So yeah.
Very cool. And you come across tsunami sand, correct?
Yes. Come across tsunami sand. I find that to be really cool. I don't know if that's everyone's opinion, but I think it's sweet.
I think it's super sweet. And can you give our participants like an image in their minds of how you can tell the difference? What does tsunami sand look like? How do you
Yeah.
know it's tsunami sand versus the mud or other parts of sediment?
Yeah, so when you touch, I wish we could do this in person so you all can touch the sediment cores. It's so much fun. You can, whenever but you could go out in your backyard and do this too. Pick up a little bit of mud and sort of roll it around between your fingers. And if it feels sandy, then it's sand. If it feels slimy, then it's mud. And there's actually something in between that we call silt. And I did not officially recommend that you do this, but if you put the mud in your mouth and rub it against your teeth, if it feels gritty, then it's silt. um, yeah, but the way that it looks is it looks like it's sand. Sometimes it's actually kind of hard to see that it's sand. So we actually do rely pretty heavily on the feel test. So if when you rub it between your fingers, if it feels sandy, then it's sand. And salt marshes typically don't have a lot of sand in them unless there's something big that happened. So unless there's like something like a tsunami. Every once in a while, a really large storm can cause sand to accumulate in the salt marsh, but we use some different techniques to distinguish between storms and tsunamis.
Very good. I guess we should emphasize the feeler test before the taste test.
Yes.
Maybe you should, you know, take a few classes in geology before the taste test, right? That's fantastic. I love it. And so if salt marshes were to go away, we have a great question of if we didn't have marshes, what would happen? Like if sea level rise were to cause all of our salt marshes to disappear, what are some of the things, I know that's a hot question, that could happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately something that a reality that we might actually face in the next 50 years or so. So a big one, like I said, salt marshes are really good at burying carbon. There are a lot of other ecosystems that will do that as well. So to some degree, that's not the biggest worry. I would say the two biggest worries that we have would be a loss of habitat. So there are tons of different species that really rely on salt marshes. In the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, salmon are really important economically, but also really culturally important. And salt marshes play an important role in their life cycle. So that would be a real issue for salmon into the future. And then the other thing is flood protection. So many people live in coastal areas on the Oregon coast, but also, in the Gulf and on the East Coast, where there are large hurricanes. And, also globally, about 50% of the global human population lives on a coastline. So if we were to lose salt marshes and other habitats like salt marshes, we would lose that protection against flooding. And so lots more people would end up losing their homes and their livelihoods. So it's worrisome.
Thank you for that. And that was an excellent question from Benjamin. And so if I can squeeze in one more quick question from Sydney, how are salt marshes impacted by our folks living on the coast? And are
Yeah.
there specific actions that are like more dramatic or more dramatically affect the habitat? So kind of in the similar
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah, that's a really great question. We unfortunately impact salt marshes a lot. There's sort of more of the physical side where we reclaim the salt marshes. So we build these large, you can kind of see it outlining this side. We build these large, what are called levees. And so they prevent water from getting onto the surface. And that can be pretty easily removed. And so then that's how they end up returning the salt marsh back to undisturbed salt marsh. But on places like more down in California, on the Gulf Coast and on the East Coast, people do a lot more land conversions. So they actually end up filling in all of this area. Like they bring in rocks and dirt from elsewhere, and they build up these areas. And after that, it's really difficult to restore the salt marsh. So beyond just sort of building on top of the salt marshes, like you can see here, we're also, causing climate change. So as sea level rises, if it rises too fast, that's bad for the salt marshes. We introduced new species called invasive species to these habitats, especially this one small salt marsh grass called Spartina alterniflora. Oregon is also, again, really special in that we have done an amazing job of keeping Spartina alterniflora out of our salt marshes, but it's super invasive down in California and up in Washington, and it's all along the East and Gulf Coast already. And then there's some other, things associated with other invasive animals and changing the chemistry of the water. You may have heard of ocean acidification. The list just sort of goes on, unfortunately.
I know that was a complex question.
Yeah.
So great question, Sydney. And I know we do have some extra questions, so maybe Erin can take a few minutes once our next speaker starts speaking to answer some of those that we didn't get to. So great questions, attendees, much appreciated. We're gonna go ahead and say thank you to Erin and transition to our next speaker. So thanks a bunch, Erin.